Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. A meeting has taken place in Vienna between Iran and the other signatories to the nuclear deal, of course, except the United States, which has walked away from that deal already. This meeting was held as Iran had already threatened that it would pass the threshold of uranium enrichment as agreed upon within that nuclear deal. Now, of course, we know the background to this. As I already mentioned, the U.S. has walked away from the deal. Sanctions are back in place on Iran. The Europeans have put in place a mechanism called Instex, which Iran is not satisfied with at this point in time about how it is operating and to what level. In this meeting as well, Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister for Political Affairs, Abbas Araghchi, has said that this meeting was not satisfactory and not enough has been done to convince Iran at this point in time, even though the Europeans have once again said they do want this deal to remain in place. Let's talk about all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Raffaele Mauriello, who is an adjunct professor in geopolitics and global security at the Sapienza University of Rome. He's joining us now from the Iranian capital, Tehran. All right, so Raffaele, tell us about what your thoughts are and what you've been observing from your venue point there in Tehran. What are the thoughts and what is the conversation like about what happened in Vienna at this meeting?
Today I was listening to the information released by the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have to say that according to what he was stating coming out from the meeting in Vienna, it is very important that yesterday the Instex, the special purpose vehicle created by three members of the European Union, the three signatories to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, has become operational. From the perspective of Iran, this was long due, although it is important, an important signal that Europe is becoming increasingly serious about actually doing something. Of course, we have to see how much this new mechanism will be able to foster commerce between Iran and the EU member states, because despite the fact that now we have 3 plus and adding shareholders, all member states of the EU can be part and use the mechanism. But the mechanism is limited to commerce that is considered humanitarian commerce. So basically, the medicine, pharmaceutics, and also agricultural products. So it is a relevant mechanism, but I have to say that listening to the Deputy Foreign Minister of Iran, he was mildly happy about the fact that actually the mechanism came into effect. But, it is the early stage. We have to look at developments.
But the interesting thing, Raffaele, is obviously this talk about the uranium enrichment threshold is looming and is like a shadow over all of this, isn't it? Because Iran was supposed to have reached that limit, I believe, a day or two ago, but it seemingly had delayed that. Now it seems that it would still reach that 202.8 kilogram limit at the weekend. What kind of an effect do you believe that will have? Because if you're essentially, going against one of the nuclear deal's commitments, then that's pretty much giving quite a strong message, isn't it?
Yeah, it isn't. Actually, I've been listening to diplomats from the European Union, and they were really worried that Iran would actually implement the threat or promise that he made. Although, today we still don't know if that limit was reached. European member states hope that Iran will not go beyond that limit, although we have to say that one of the reasons perhaps that Europe has become more serious, and many other actors like China, about defending the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is precisely because Iran, after a year of waiting and patience, has become more active in arguing for the necessity of defending the JCPOA. So we have to wait up to the moment that the IAEA does not confirm that Iran has gone beyond that limit. It is difficult to grasp the consequences. And we have also to remember that this is one of the provisions of the agreement. The agreement is more complex. So we have to wait and see what will happen. And in certain respects, it is legitimate from Iran to scale down the compromise of the agreement, considering that other states have not lived up to the expectations of the agreement.
One of the things, Raffaele, which is interesting and is an interesting aspect of all of this is that do you think that Rouhani's government has sort of put itself in a corner And by talking about the limit of uranium enrichment as it did, has it not already sort of made the decision to the Iranian public that, listen, it will stand up for Iran and will now do whatever it needs to do to defend the country, whether the Europeans or others get angry?
Yeah, I think that the announcement made by the current president of the Islamic Republic of Iran was both intended to the public consumption, I mean, within Iran and outside of Iran. You have to consider next year we will have parliamentary elections in Iran, and later on, 2 years' time, elections for the new president. And Rouhani cannot be part of, cannot become again a candidate. But the group that supports him is very interested in, of course, sticking to power. So I think that the announcement was made both to compel other parts of the agreement, in particular the EU, but again also China, to do more, and also to tell to the public that we are doing something, because Iranians are really tired, they're stuck in a situation that cannot hold anymore. Iran has an important resilience, but still patience, and Iranians, I know because I also work here, have run short of patience in the sense that cannot stand anymore a situation where they are not gaining anything from the agreement. So I think that it was long overdue, actually, a statement by the president of actually doing something, trying to defend the agreement. And I think that is more concerted response from Iran. If you consider also the downing of the drone by the Iranian military and other actions, I think that the government, in accordance to the other part of the Iranian state, have decided it is time to act and to do it diplomatically. This government is mostly interested in international relations than geopolitics, although geopolitics is relevant. So what they are doing is what diplomats will do, try to make a case and then see the reaction on the other side, and then add something on. This is how diplomacy works.
But, you know, I wonder what kind of an effect all of this can have for Iranians themselves, Raffaele, because you and I both know what was sold to the Iranian public through this deal, be it through Foreign Minister Zarif or others, as the deal was being signed, and about how it was spoken about that sanctions would be lifted, even all U.S. sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think that in many ways that the public is not actually prepared for what is to then come? Because if Iran were to contravene the deal, the Europeans have said that they would react severely as well, that they would place sanctions back on, they would start respecting U.S. sanctions, for example.
Yeah, I have to distinguish, what European diplomats, of course, say and what they actually are willing to do in the long term. But if you look at Iranians, yes, they are at the same time worried of the consequence of a possible war, but also tired. No one today, to my understanding, would vote again for Rouhani. So there is a double standard, if you want, also within Iran as far as the GCPOA is concerned, because Zarif, that was actually a major actor in the agreement, is very much respected and esteemed among the wider population. But I wouldn't say the same case is of the current president. So Iranians at the beginning felt how positive were the effects of the agreement. If we come back to 2 years ago, we had important social and economic effects of the agreement. The agreement didn't bring the old expectations that Iranians had, but still was relevant both in social, political, and economic terms. But right now, Iranians don't see any benefit in being in the agreement. If you speak with the majority of Iranians, perhaps they will say that we should leave the agreement. I think the government is at the least listening now to the population. It has not done so necessarily in the last 2 years, but now it's time to act. And Iranians are worried, but at the same time, they want the government to do something. But if you consider, for example, a relevant issue in the economy of Iran, the access to foreign exchange, euros and dollars, in the recent 4 months, the government has been very effective in controlling. It's difficult to go back to the value the real had a year ago. But if you consider that after the dawning of the drone, the exchange rate of the real didn't change, that is relevant. That means that the government at least was successful in trying to start doing something.
But then, Raffaele, and I'm glad you brought up because that's vital here, isn't it? obviously the sanctions and all of the above was meant to strengthen the Iranian economy. Do you think in some ways that that promise and that sort of factor in all of this has sort of backfired in a sense? As you said, that there was light at the end of the tunnel at the beginning when this deal had first been signed, but it seems that things have gotten quite bad. I mean, even my own sources within Iran would say that prices on very basic items are almost doubling on a weekly basis. That sort of a situation adds a lot of pressure, doesn't it, on the Iranian establishment?
Yes, of course. I will say that, of course, it backfired in the sense, in many respects. One of them, it was basically that the economy slowly opened up. That meant that at the end of the day, it was more easy for the United States to put pressure on the economy because of several issues. So if you look at things now, of course, it backfired. Perhaps it wasn't worth at the beginning. We will see in the long terms. It really depends on what's going on. But I think interesting things are ahead of us. If you consider the fact that there is this very interesting coalition among the European Union, Iran and China, a de facto coalition vis-à-vis the United States, no one would have imagined that 2 years ago. But if you consider now China is buying Iranian oil despite of sanctions, that the EU have operationalized an instrument that is supposed to go around the sanctions of the United States. This is very interesting in terms of geopolitics and international relations. I have to say that, yes, the Iranians are paying a high price for this role that Iran is playing in the international scene. But I think that resilience and what Iranians call resistance is something that Iranians cannot avoid, in the sense that one of the reasons the Iranians did the revolution, the first reason was independence. So they didn't reach necessarily the other issues. But yes, independence is a very basic element of the Islamic Republic. And going back to the economy, I think that the main reason that Rouhani decided to actually act was precisely of the economy. As you were saying, it backfired because now basic issues, basic stuff that you need to buy, milk, bread, have soared in their prices. So yes, Iranians are paying a high price, but to my understanding, the economy of Iran can still try to oppose these sanctions, although there is not a so big window of opportunity. This is why the current government decided to act.
So then I wonder, at this point, as you mentioned, with the downing of the U.S. drone as well, Raffaele, there's two tracks to what's happening, it seems, when it comes to Iran, isn't there? There's what Iran would, of course, term economic warfare. And then there is the other track, which is more direct, which is seemingly more military in style, where it was about the U.S. talking about, a buildup of its forces in the region, et cetera, et cetera. Is Iran in a weakened position, do you think, when it comes to all of the above? Yes, it sent a message when it came to the U.S. drone downing, but with a country, with an economy that is significantly weaker now, can it actually put up enough of a fight to be able to defend itself if there is any further escalation in the region?
The point is that, from my perspective, Iran will put up a fight in any case. How long they can sustain this fight is questionable. But if you know Iran, and this is your case, Iranians will put up a fight. I have no doubt in this respect. From my perspective, I don't see a war coming, and I don't believe in the threats posed by the United States, because in this respect, the United States now is in a very weak position because it doesn't almost have any military ally in the EU. Not a single EU country, even Great Britain, the UK, denied the idea of adding forces to control the Strait of Hormuz. That is relevant. If you consider how usually the UK acts respect vis-à-vis the United States, it was remarkable that the Great Britain denied the idea of bringing more forces to the Strait of Hormuz. And not a single other European country will do that. And if you consider that now, according to the information we have as regards Instex, in addition to the three main partners, Germany, Great Britain, and France, other countries such as Spain, and the Netherlands, Belgium, have already said that they will support instincts. In general terms, I would say that the United States are very much isolated on the international scene. You cannot do a war against Iran solo. You need to bring a coalition, and I don't see any coalition coming. How much the Iranian economy is able to stand to the pressure of the United States, that is relevant. And of course, Iran cannot do it alone. It needs the support of other countries buying oil, in particular, I have to say China, and in the long run, India, and of Europe trying to bring fresh cash, euros, in the Iranian economy. And Instex is precisely being built for this reason. So it really depends on how long other international actors are willing to defend their own interests, being along with Iran.
Okay, Raffaele, we'll leave there as our final thought. Of course, we appreciate you speaking to us there from Tehran this afternoon. Certainly your vantage point is an important one, and we'll be referring to you, I'm sure, in the coming days and weeks as well to continue to get your thoughts and your expert insight on what's the vantage point, again, from Iran and what the Iranian officials and people are saying about this important topic. Now, viewers, there are two dates to keep in mind. One is this weekend itself. Will there be an announcement by the Iranian government and Iranian officials that Iran has passed that threshold of 202.8 kilograms of uranium enrichment, which was the threshold, agreed upon within the nuclear deal? If Iran were to pass that threshold, it would then be in contravention of that part of the nuclear deal, from my understanding. And then there is the other date of July 7th, where it says Iran will begin enriching even more uranium that would be closer to weapons grade levels. So we're at very sensitive juncture here when it comes to the nuclear deal. It really is hanging by a thread. Raffaele there spoke about the deputy foreign minister, of Iran, Abbas Araghchi, who sounded a bit more positive about this. But is it enough? Is Instex, as it stands right now, enough to save the nuclear deal? Will the Europeans actually act? We'll have to wait and see. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the G20 summit, which has now wrapped up in Osaka, Japan. Quite a few topics, obviously, being discussed. We've been hearing from Shinzo Abe himself, the Japanese Prime Minister, as well as President Donald Trump and other officials as well, such as the Turkish leader. But it seemed that the dominant topic here at this summit, on the sidelines at the very least, and at the summit itself, was the trade war. At least that overshadowed a lot of the conversations that were taking place. And of course, the stalled talks with North Korea also, of course, of great importance. There were a lot of other topics, of course, which we can talk about as well, but we're going to try to hone in on those two topics at the least and see where that takes us with our guests who are joining us right now. We're joined by Jonathan Miller, who is a senior fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs. He's joining us now from Tokyo. We're also joined by John Lyman, who is editor-in-chief of the International Policy Digest. He's joining us now from Seoul. And we're also joined by Brendon O'Connor, who is postgraduate coordinator and associate professor in American politics at the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. He's joining us now from Sydney. Brendon, John, and Jonathan, thank you all for joining us. Jonathan, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What did you make of the fact that, we now have this, at least the Xinhua news agency is reporting that Trump has decided that he'll not be placing more tariffs on Chinese imports? How significant is that when it comes to progress on these trade talks?
Well, thanks very much for having me on, and it's a pleasure to talk on these issues. From my perspective, I think, as you mentioned, the U.S.-China trade tensions really was overshadowing or had the potential to overshadow much of this summit. So first, just from Japan's perspective as host, I think for Shinzo Abe, I think that his main goal of this was not necessarily to have the most sterling outcome of this, or a very firm communique, or even very significant progress on some of the items. But I think he very much wanted not to have the distractions take over. So, from his perspective, I think looking at the U.S. and China, at least coming to some sort of a temporary truce this over the weekend, I think is a positive thing. If you actually delve in a little bit deeper to it, though, I'm a little bit skeptical. I mean, if you look really, the U.S.-China trade tensions, whether it's on IPR or forced technology transfer or the role of state-owned enterprises, and even the most recent executive order facing Huawei, these are structural issues that are hard to repair, and I think this is one of the reasons why the negotiations have been having their hills and valleys. So, while it's positive, it's a positive sign. I think the markets will probably react positively to it. I'm worried about how long this can be sustained. I think that often when Trump has summits, he tends to kind of come out in a more kind of jovial sense. We know he likes to talk about his positive relationship with Xi Jinping. So we're becoming normal or used to this sense of whenever he meets with China, he comes out with a sort of a softer tone, or now things are getting better, and then shortly afterwards it kind of devolves again when he realizes that the trade talks aren't necessarily going to go in the direction that he hopes. So, not to be too skeptical, but that's somewhat my kind of fear of where this might go in the coming weeks and months.
That's a very good point, Jonathan. Brendon, I get your thoughts on that because, certainly Trump seemed very positive on many issues, in fact, when he was talking to the press there. Obviously, talking about Xi Jinping in very positive terms, and about the fact that he believes that the trade talks are going in a positive direction, and then even about North Korea and wanting to meet Kim Jong-un at the DMZ. Do you think, again, as Jonathan there said, that this is just essentially just Trump 101, that's how he is at conferences and summits, but what happens in actuality on the ground is quite different?
Yes, I mean, I think that the theatrics are always part of what Trump's doing when he's on an international stage. But if we remember those early G7 meetings, the early NATO meetings, Trump was often at odds with his, particularly his European allies. So there was some sense, strangely, that he's maybe more comfortable with people like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, maybe even Erdogan, strangely. These authoritarian leaders who he seems to be able to enjoy their company. The tougher they are, the more he seems to bring out the sort of machismo side of Trump, and then his ability in the press conference to make light of many issues, maybe misrepresent some issues. There were issues to do with selling anti-aircraft sort of missiles to the Turks. The problem with the Obama administration was that the Turks wanted the technology, not just the missiles. So he misrepresented a number of issues. We're used to that with Trump, but he did seem in a more jovial mood than we remember in that early G7 summit in Canada early on in the Trump presidency and the early NATO summits, where he was almost having a little tantrum at times, where at least he's become more comfortable with his, own presence at these events. But outcomes, with Trump, the devil is in the detail, and there wasn't a lot of detail over this weekend. But there was at least not a worsening of that trade war, which would have been, that would have been very unfortunate as an outcome of this summit.
Indeed. John, give us the point of view from South Korea. Imagine the South Koreans would have been happy about, A, the fact that Trump is about to visit South Korea, and B, about his offer to North Korea to meet Kim Jong-un at the DMZ.
Yeah, they are. Thank you for having me. Any opportunity that Trump has to meet with Kim Jong-un is a positive development for diplomacy. But I think for a lot of analysts and just experts on North Korea behavior, they wonder to what end is he meeting Kim Jong-un? Is it simply to shake his hand and cross the border into North Korea for that photo op? Or is there actual real progress going to be made? And I think where it stands, the North Koreans very much want sanction relief, and the Trump administration isn't prepared to give that to them. So I think you're essentially where you were at the start of the Trump administration, minus missile tests. So I think that's the big unfortunate moment right now we have in relations.
But then I imagine, John, for Kim Jong-un, it would be quite an important photo op, wouldn't it, to be meeting Donald Trump at the demilitarized zone? It's important for him too, politically, certainly.
Yeah, of course. He's met him twice now. And they've exchanged these letters of appreciation and friendship letters. So it simply affords Kim Jong-un the photo op and the recognition that he seeks. He craves that international recognition. And I think Trump is willing to give that to him because Trump very much sees this as path to a Nobel Peace Prize, which is unfortunate.
Jonathan, do you think that going when it comes to these stalled talks as they currently stand, that obviously, we know Moon Jae-in came into office wanting peace on the Korean Peninsula and peace with North Korea to an extent, and the end of that, the official end to the war, etc. Do you think that on this trip to South Korea that Donald Trump will be able to achieve any of the above or achieve progress in some regard on those stalled talks?
Well, I think, I would agree with John and others as they've kind of discussed on this. I mean, I think that Trump has invested so much into this now. I mean, Moon Jae-in obviously has invested the most into these talks. I think one of the challenges, I mean, obviously it was a bold decision, and in some ways, I mean, there's some benefits, I think, of the idea of kind of going top-down with the two summits that he's had so far in Singapore and Hanoi. But the problem, I think, when you go top-down is that you know those other options. The reason that diplomacy usually goes from bottom up is that you have those other levers, those other kind of escape hatches. You're building up to what can happen at a high-level summit. So, frankly, the failures of both of those summits, I think, leave little room now. There's only so many times that both sides can say, we expect you to denuclearize, and then the North Korean side can say, well, no, thank you. We expect sanctions relief. So I think this is going to be the trick. And the thing that I think from Japan's perspective, and that's where I'm looking at this right now, and it's a deep concern in Japan, is the gradual kind of erosion of the U.S. position, formerly kind of focused on civet or the complete irreversible dismantlement of the programs, now to kind of a more civet light, or I think they're calling fully verified dismantlement. This is concerning to Japan because especially on the medium range and intermediate range and short range missiles. Now the Trump administration, Secretary of State Pompeo, I think it was about a month ago or 6 weeks ago, said essentially what we're focused on is the long range tests and nuclear tests, and that's basically what the main concern for us is, and that's something that very much upsets people in Tokyo, and I think should in Seoul as well. Considering their vulnerability to the more shorter and medium range missiles. So how, this, where the wiggle room is, whether there is a desire in the Trump administration from some of his team or from Trump himself to actually to loosen their current position on denuclearization, I think is going to have consequences on both sides. Potentially, the North won't go for one if it's more maximalist, but if it's more minimalist in the sense of taking a weaker position on the ballistic missiles, I think it's going to have issues for alliance management.
All right, so, Brendon, I imagine, obviously, when we're talking about denuclearization, we can't but bring up Iran as well and the nuclear deal and how all of that is working out as well and how the U.S. acted towards that nuclear deal, essentially just walking away from it, as Donald Trump had promised, mind you, as candidate before he even came into office. Do you think that in many ways the North Koreans have taken lesson from that, and that's why they possibly are playing a hardball to an even greater extent than they may have originally?
I think if you listen to Trump's press conference today, it was kind of classic Trump in that he was talking about what he got out of the security arrangement with the Japanese. The Japanese had to offer some kind of guarantee that, they'd defend America in the worst case scenario. Similarly with the trade sort of talks, there's always this zero-sum game with Trump. If we're giving you too much, we're losing out, you've got to give us more. And so with the North Koreans, I think it's similarly a case of, what's the threat to America? It's intercontinental ballistic missiles. It's not, short-range missiles. So once again, if it's a problem to America, then it's going to be a big problem for the North Koreans. But if it's a problem for Seoul or the Japanese, it's not so much of a problem for the Americans. So Trump doesn't have the kind of collective security. He doesn't have that mentality that we're used to of a lot of American presidents by seeing a kind of global role of leadership. He sees things from an American first perspective. And that's what we've got, in spades, really, in the summit, and we've had throughout the Trump presidency. This very narrow sort of notion of what American interests are. And so I think that someone like, the North Koreans can kind of play into that. They can see themselves as massaging Trump's ego by having these summits, but it's unfortunate that you have a movement away from the six-party talks and things which spread the burden in some ways of responsibility in the region and got the Chinese involved, where, with these summits, it's, Trump's bought into it, as one of your other guests was saying, as a road to the sort of Nobel Peace Prize. Now, he's not going to win that, but in some ways he's tied himself into this narrative that he's a great deal maker and peacemaker. And there's some benefits for that. It's better than talking about fire and fury, but it's a pretty narrow path to what can be achieved in those negotiations.
So, John, I imagine this all puts, again, Moon Jae-in and the South Korean government in an awkward position over and over again, doesn't it? When Donald Trump, yo-yos back and forth when it comes to North Korea or even other issues in that region. Do you think that South Korea is in favor of six-party talks? Do you think that it is, what do you think, actually, let me put it this way, the conversations are like behind the scenes with Donald Trump? Do you think that they're seeking a bit more stability when it comes to how Trump treats this entire issue?
Well, I think obviously they're any approach that could achieve their ends, they would gladly accept it. But Moon's in a tough spot. His legacy very much depends on reaching a peace agreement with North Korea, normalizing relations. The economy of South Korea is not exactly where it needs to be. It has a lot of problems with air quality. It's an aging population, so it has a lot of domestic issues. So obviously Moon very much looks at the North Korea issue as his legacy builder, which is unfortunate if you hinge your legacy on one issue that's so complicated as North Korea. So obviously, even with the recent famine in North Korea and his agreement to send tons of rice to help alleviate the suffering, he very much approaches North Korea in not a desperate fashion, but in an overeager outreach, which I think is a position of weakness.
Okay, we'll just be going into a very short break, ladies and gentlemen, but do stay with us. Jonathan, John, and Brendon will be staying with us, and we'll be right back with them right after this. We're back now, viewers, with Jonathan, John, and Brendon. Jonathan, I wanted to hone in on the Japanese leader's visit to Iran not too long ago and his at least rumored mediation role between the United States and Iran in that case. Do you think that he was just looking for, as many people had said, a bit more recognition on the international stage in the lead up to the G20 summit? And do you think that Japan is actually well placed to be involved in discussions, be it North Korea, be it Iran's nuclear deal, etc.?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think ahead of this visit, first of all, to put some context, Japan has had a pretty long historical relationship with Iran, predating the most recent round of nuclear talks. This is something that goes back to the 50s. A very warm historical relationship between Japan and Iran. Despite that fact, though, Abe is the first prime minister to have visited in over 4 decades. So, even though that there has been constant contact, the business community has been interested in investing in Iran for several decades and has made some attempts before, and unfortunately was burned when some of the sanctions were put in place. But Japan has valued that relationship with Iran. So I think there's, on one hand, this is something that those who are focused kind of the Middle East hands within Japan's and their foreign ministry have kind of wanted to push this forward for some years, and they saw an opportunity. I think it's also important to kind of contextualize this, less so in the U.S.-Iran perspective. I do think that Abe wanted to get a blessing from Trump, and when Trump visited Japan in May, he obviously wanted to float this idea, and not so much as can I play a mediator role, can I pass notes to the Iranian leadership, but I think more so in the sense that he wanted to basically get the U.S. approval that there wouldn't be pushback or there wouldn't be criticism for Abe taking this trip. I think you're right that basically the rationale for him was less. I think Japan's quite realistic on what it can do in this sense and how difficult this situation is. Yeah. But I think it was more that Abe saw this domestically as a low risk chance before this upper house election, which is a very key election happening in July in Japan. And if you see this in the light of some of the other initiatives that Abe has been trying to make legacies on, such as resolving the territorial dispute with Russia, the abductions issue with North Korea, and even potentially changing the constitution in Japan, all three of those are very, very difficult. And Iran is not going to take the place or be a massive legacy issue, but I think from his perspective, it was a low-risk, historic type of opportunity. I think the where things kind of fell apart for him was not so much on the response from the Iranians to the mediation efforts. I think that, in a way, was kind of, I think it was to be expected, even though it kind of came out very harsh. I think it was more, obviously, what happened in the Strait of Hormuz at the time, the tanker attacks, and one of them being a Japanese-owned attack. So I think that really changed the calculus and kind of tarnished that trip for Abe.
Brendon, I wonder what your thoughts on that. Do you think that Donald Trump did seek to have Abe be involved a bit more in discussions between the U.S. and Iran? And do you think that at this point in time, how do you assess then how Trump has been talking about Iran? Because, it seems, again, on that issue, as is classical Trump, he's been yo-yoing, hasn't he? He made some statements saying that he respects Iran, he respects Iran's leadership, and then, a day later or so, he would tweet something quite harsh about Iran, and then we had the U.S. drone being shot down, the oil tanker attacks, of course, previously. It's been back and forth, hasn't it? So it's been very hard to place exactly what the U.S. policy at this very point in time is when it comes to Iran.
Yes, and you have advisors within the Trump administration like John Bolton and Pompeo, who are very tough on Iran, have been, in Bolton's case, pressing for a U.S. invasion or attacks on Iran for over 10 years. So Trump, in some ways, has been the moderating force in some of those discussions, but then again, erratic, making arguments that if Iran engages back in not just civil testing of nuclear materials, but engages back in a sort of program that could lead to weaponization, that he would respond very dramatically and maybe with attacks. So there's a lot of threats that have gone in. Then there's occasionally Trump sort of pulling back and saying, well, we'll negotiate under any sort of conditions. So it's very hard to make sense of his Iranian policy. And I think that's been a problem for allies. I mean, he's been pushing for allies, the Japanese, but the Europeans as well, to come in and, shepherd ships through the Straits of Hormuz. And that would create a lot of tension. The potential for an accident is very high. In the 1980s, we had this with the Reagan administration with a similar incident to some extent. And it led to this tragic shooting down of a passenger airline that we forget about. 290 Iranians were killed as the Americans mistook a passenger airline for a jet that was attacking American troops. So we do not want this kind of a repeat of that situation of kind of militarizing this important kind of commercial area. But with Trump, the future on this area is something I constantly are holding my breath on and sort of just hoping for the best, because the potential for misunderstanding. These are two sides that don't communicate in the best way with each other. There's some domestic benefits for both sides to exaggerate the threat. So, this is a tinderbox in lots of ways, and one that we can hope just somehow escapes, overreaction.
And, John, from a South point of view, we know that South Korea, for it, oil would be extremely important, as, of course, for many other U.S. allies around the world as well. But in the context of South Korea, its imports of oil from Iran, which it has now lessened, of course, to quite an extent, that still affects South Korea, doesn't it? And these tensions, even though far from South Korea itself, they're important for South Korea, aren't they?
Yeah, of course. I mean, South Korea's economy is at this point where its growth has slowed. It's not in a recession, certainly, but it certainly can't afford to see a hit to its economy as far as oil imports. So obviously, it welcomes the lack of armed conflict between the two sides. But North Korea has also not developed a lot of energy alternatives. It still burns coal. It relies on oil, so it needs to kind of get out of this sort of energy black box. It needs to develop more renewable sources.
So then going forward then, Jonathan, if I may, I'm wondering, all of these U.S. allies, they're trying to obviously figure out in their own respective ways how to deal with the Trump administration. And that seemed to be the focus again at the G20 summit, didn't it? Where everyone was trying to figure out in their sideline meetings that they had with Trump. I believe he had 9 meetings on just the first day of the summit with respective leaders around the world. Do you think that Donald Trump has come into his own now finally when it comes to these sort of international meetings? Is he finding more stable ground when it comes to his policies, or is it just chaos as has been from day one?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think I would kind of go with the latter. I think, I mean, it seems that even if you think in advance of this G20 summit, I mean, even to take it from a Japan perspective, which is, arguably the U.S.'s most important ally in the Asia-Pacific region and the host of the G20, just days before that, the reports came out that Trump was thinking about, musing about abrogating the alliance with Japan, which was sort of an unthinkable, almost a sacred cow in a way that they would even think about that. So that kind of that shocked Abe and obviously embarrassed him in front before the summit. And you have to contextualize that too, in the sense that Abe has bent over backwards to really facilitate a good personal relationship with Trump. So I think that there are differences between the different allies. I mean, obviously the EU is not happy with the Trump administration as it pertains to Iran and the JCPOA, as it pertains to trade and other issues. The U.S. has had challenges with Canada and Mexico also on trade and on migration when it comes to Mexico. So I think that there's different levels of displeasure, I think, with the Trump administration. I think some are being more tactical about it, some are being more strategic about it. I think from Japan's perspective, I think they realize that while Trump has been a challenge, the U.S. remains the most important ally and is indispensable for them. So I think it's how they respond to this. I mean, one of the challenges I think will be China, I think, is trying to kind of, in a sense, fill part of that gap. But you could even see Xi Jinping during many of his sideline meetings of the G20 talking about the need not to have coercive trade practices, not labeling the U.S., but essentially trying to kind of talk to some U.S. allies and partners through the sideline meetings, basically saying that this is not necessarily all China's fault, but this is largely the U.S. kind of bullying us. I don't know that argument's being bought by many in capitals in Europe and in Australia and the U.S. and Japan, but I think that increasingly the way that the Trump administration articulates itself on some of these issues is eroding some of its credibility with allies. There's no question.
Okay, so let's talk about credibility for a moment, Brent, because when it came to Australia, in fact, if I may hone in on that context for just a moment, Trump, praised Philip Morrison and, the Australian government's policies when it comes to immigration. And obviously we know that he even tweeted then, I believe, Australia's flyers or whatever I may call them, posters, pardon me, about immigration and, trying to, discourage people from trying to use the sea path to enter into Australia. What did you make of that in the context of how Australia has been criticized around the world for its immigration policies and how it treats illegal migrants versus, what Trump is planning on the border with Mexico, et cetera?
Yes, I mean, on this issue we have a global refugee crisis. You have one of the highest levels of refugees in the world at the moment since, the Second World War. You also have this kind of climate change crisis, an issue where the science is very strong. So for those two issues not to be addressed with seriousness, I mean, for Trump to constantly go back to his domestic politics of this dispute with the Democrats over how to patrol the border, whether he's going to have funding for his wall, whether he can coerce Mexico through trade sanctions into getting his own way. It's a tragedy because there's such a bigger issue at stake of, literally millions of people in camps around the world and displaced from the Syrian civil war and other issues. So to have such a narrow cast focus, which, draws this attention to the approach in Australia, which is an incredibly narrow approach for electoral politics as well in the Australian context, rather than seeing it as a regional issue and a global issue. So it plays to Trump's sort of worst instincts, an issue like this. Scott Morrison, who was recently re-elected in Australia, is probably pretty fortunate that the G20 came after the election rather than before. I mean, Trump doesn't play particularly well in Australian politics, so to be praised by Trump is not something that most leaders would look forward to. Even Boris Johnson, in his recent campaign, probably doesn't want Trump coming out and saying he's my man. This is a surefire way to get some resistance to a candidate. So it really showed, I think, in some ways, the kind of worst instincts of Trump coming on an issue that's got such a difficult and important global issue.
We'll leave that as our final word, and I did miss. I called Scott Morrison, Philip Morrison. Apologies for that, viewers. But I'll thank Brendon, John, and Jonathan for their time and, of course, expert insight today, and for sharing their thoughts, of course, on the G20 summit, day 2, and how it all concluded. Viewers, we got through quite a bit, of course, but obviously, as I said in my introduction, what overshadowed this summit was the trade war between China and the United States. But that wasn't the only issue on the agenda or what was spoken about mainly at the summit, and specifically, of course, and most importantly, on the sidelines. There was also talk about North Korea, that Trump tweet, that offer to meet Kim Jong-un at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. There was also some talk about the tensions with Iran. There was talk, as I said there at the end, praising Scott Morrison of Australia about his immigration policies. Australia, of course, as we know, has very harsh immigration policies towards illegal migrants, specifically those coming via the sea, trying to enter the country, fleeing from persecution, etc. We'll keep a very close eye on how all of this develops. Trump, of course, now going to South Korea. Will he actually meet Kim Jong-un at the DMZ? What will now happen when it comes to those stalled talks? That's probably one of the most important questions for the coming days to watch and see. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.